Chapter 27: The Perverse Incentives of Late-Stage Civilizations, when decline becomes the system's operating logic. Perverse incentives are the final expression of a civilization whose internal logic has inverted. They appear when behaviors that accelerate long-term decline become the most rational choices for individuals, institutions, and political actors. At this stage, decay is no longer accidental. It is structurally incentivized. The system rewards the actions that weaken it and penalizes the actions that would restore capability. Reversal becomes extraordinarily difficult because decline is now adaptive. Perverse incentives do not emerge suddenly. They accumulate from earlier structural failures, capability erosion, demographic inversion, administrative overload, elite overproduction, coordination breakdown, and information decay. Each stage shifts incentives slightly, until eventually the system reaches a tipping point where rational actors must behave in ways that are destructive to the society's future. Decline becomes the path of least resistance. The first and most fundamental perverse incentive is the incentive to avoid responsibility. In high-capability systems, responsibility is an honor because success is plausible. In low-capability, high-complexity systems, responsibility is a liability. Failure is structurally baked in. Success requires overcoming constraints no individual can control. Rational actors therefore avoid initiative, defer decisions, hide behind procedures, or transfer risk upward and outward. A defensive culture emerges. The safest career path is to do nothing that could be blamed later. This kills reform at the root. Initiative becomes dangerous, and action becomes prudent. The next perverse incentive is the incentive to fail. Late-stage institutions receive more resources when they perform poorly. Schools with declining outcomes receive intervention funding. Hospitals with long waiting lists receive expansions. Agencies that mismanage risk receive new oversight powers. Crime-ridden districts receive additional policing budgets. Bureaucratic failure produces bureaucratic growth. Success, by contrast, often leads to budget reductions or loss of relevance. Rational institutions maximize dysfunction because dysfunction maximizes resources. Decline becomes self-reinforcing. Political systems exhibit their own late-stage perversions. Short election cycles reward symbolic gestures, subsidies, and messaging victories over structural reform. The political actor who attempts to fix education, pensions, infrastructure, or demographic trajectories receives no reward within a single term. Rational politicians therefore prioritize immediate optics, stimulus payments, public announcements, popular but empty legislation, while deferring existential problems into the future. The system punishes long-term thinking. Politics becomes a mechanism for mortgaging the future to stabilize the present. This problem interacts with voter myopia. Aging societies with inverted population pyramids empower voters whose remaining time horizon is short. Their rational preferences, protecting pensions, avoiding disruption, resisting major structural reform, are incompatible with long-term stability. Politicians respond to those incentives, further narrowing the time horizon of national decision-making. A civilization becomes governed by actors who have the least long-term stake in its survival. Bureaucracies develop their own self-protective distortions. Under stress, they expand horizontally and vertically, adding committees, layers, compliance units, and specialist offices. Each new layer justifies its existence by generating additional procedures. Complexity becomes its own justification because complexity guarantees relevance and budget. Simplification is punished, complication is rewarded. Rational bureaucrats become architects of friction, creating systems no one can navigate without bureaucratic mediation. Institutional survival displaces institutional purpose. Education systems collapse under similar incentives. Credential inflation motivates universities to lower academic standards to maintain enrollment. Administrators focus on marketing rather than intellectual rigor. Lecturers pass underperforming students to preserve throughput metrics. Employers respond by raising credential requirements, inflating demand for degrees even as the real capability they signal collapses. Society fills with paper elites, Individuals with credentials but without the capability required to sustain a high-complexity industrial civilization. Rational actors contribute to intellectual degradation because the system rewards symbolic achievement. Media ecosystems develop late-stage incentives of their own. Outrage, pessimism, tribal loyalty, and emotional content outperform precision, nuance, and sober analysis. Platforms reward conflict because conflict is profitable. Information environments fracture. Rational journalists and content creators amplify dysfunction because dysfunction maximizes attention. Public cognition collapses under algorithmic incentives optimized for engagement, not truth. Corporate structures exhibit parallel distortions. Executive compensation tied to quarterly metrics incentivizes cost-cutting, outsourcing, buybacks, and financial engineering. Long-term investment in expertise, research, and durable capability becomes irrational. Firms hollow themselves out while appearing financially strong. Rational executives dismantle the future of their own organizations because the system rewards short-term extraction. Urban governance becomes hostage to perverse incentives. Prosecutors decline cases to reduce caseloads. Police avoid proactive enforcement to avoid political backlash. Judges minimize sentencing to avoid legal risk. Municipal agencies avoid controversial action to preserve careers. Disorder becomes self-replicating because every institutional actor optimizes against their own personal exposure rather than for collective order. Rational officials allow deterioration because confronting it is hazardous. Healthcare systems follow similar logic. Prevention yields little revenue. Chronic treatment yields recurring revenue. Hospitals profit from recurrent admissions. Pharmaceutical companies profit from lifelong medication. Insurers profit from complexity. Specialists profit from fragmentation. Rational actors design systems that stabilize illness rather than eliminate it. Health systems evolve to perpetuate disease patterns because the economic incentives favor maintenance, not resolution. Environmental governance becomes symbolic. Agencies pursue minor, politically palatable interventions while avoiding major, disruptive reforms. Banning trivial plastics is safe, approving nuclear power is dangerous. Rational environmental actors pursue symbolic virtue rather than substantive protection because the system rewards visibility, not impact. Immigration systems produce their own late-stage distortions. Businesses lobby for cheap labor. Governments rely on immigration to mask demographic decline. NGOs expand their funding through asylum services. Political actors cultivate loyal constituencies through citizenship pathways. Each actor behaves rationally within their own incentive frame. Yet the collective outcome is institutional overload, administrative fragmentation, and demographic destabilization. The system imports complexity faster than it can expand capability. Cultural incentives degrade last. Societies reward those who criticize, deconstruct, and destabilize rather than those who build. Prestige accrues to those who attack norms rather than maintain or refine them. In late-stage civilizations, cultural capital concentrates in fragmentation because fragmentation is fashionable. Rational cultural actors accelerate decay because the system rewards narratives that dissolve cohesion. Individuals respond rationally to the dissolution of the social contract. As trust declines, fertility becomes uneconomical, community involvement irrational, and civic obligations burdensome. Citizens withdraw into private life. They minimize exposure, hoard resources, and avoid collective commitments. Rational behavior accelerates demographic and social collapse. The final and most destructive incentive is the incentive to lie. When institutions punish honesty and reward conformity, truth becomes a liability. Reality becomes dangerous. Narratives become currency. Actors distort metrics, suppress failures, curate appearances, and retreat into performative communication. Leaders receive stylized fictions instead of accurate reports. The civilization becomes epistemically blind. It cannot self-correct because it cannot perceive itself. This is the endpoint, a societal configuration where decline is not merely occurring but rewarded, where the most rational actions for individuals and institutions produce the most irrational outcomes for the civilization. At this stage, collapse is no longer a possibility, It is a structural trajectory. The next chapter traces the mechanics of that trajectory, how perverse incentives fuse into downward spirals and feedback loops that no internal actor can reverse.